The sharp cry of the little miss echoed through the slave quarters like a wail from the old spirits, but Rita no longer ran to it. Instead, her calloused hands clutched the blade, hidden in her apron, her eyes fixed on the door of the big house. The barking of the fierce hounds mixed with the screams of the white nursemaid who was falling to her knees, her body convulsing in pus and foul blood that spilled forth like a living curse. The scene was terrifying, a canvas of horror unfolding before her, yet Rita felt no fear. The pain and rage pulsed in her veins, like an ancestral drum calling her to action. She knew Mistress Eleanor hadn't stopped there. 2 days prior, in an act of unbridled jealousy, the mistress had torn Rita's newborn daughter from her arms and thrown her to the hounds on the porch, the dogs devouring the child's tender flesh in seconds. Rita had roared with a pain that shattered her heart like a clay jug from the motherland. Now, in the dark cookhouse, lit only by a distant moon, she had to have justice. Rita forced the mistress to swallow the last gulp of the bitter root infusion, the stench of decay rising like a vapor from hell. "Drink, mistress, drink the milk of vengeance you denied my own child," she whispered, her voice low and venomous, as Eleanor's eyes widened in agony. The woman gurgled, her nails digging into Rita's arm. The mistress's body contorted, bloating like a corpse by the river's edge, and Rita did not blink as she wiped her hands on the stained cloth. Inside her, the desire for revenge simmered. A dark incense lit in the shadows of the plantation. The footsteps of the overseer, drawing near, were a grim warning, a shadow looming over decisions of life and death. Coming to her senses, Rita knew there was no longer room for weakness. The question hung in the humid air: how could a wet nurse, whose arms were both cradle and prison, turn poison into justice without the entire plantation going up in flames? She felt the weight of the chains that bound her, a constant reminder of her condition and the suffering she shared with her enslaved brothers and sisters. The faces of other mothers, their own children torn from them, flashed through her mind. She was not just Rita, she was the embodiment of a legion of oppressed souls, a silent warrior on an invisible battlefield. Hearing the barks grow louder, the pressure forced her to make a choice. With a swift move, she slipped through the kitchen door, the blade tight in her palm. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out, much like the history of pain and struggle itself. Rita did not pause to consider failure. The memory of her daughter, now a distant echo, pushed her forward, driving her toward a future where such cruelties would not be repeated. The big house stood like a monolith of oppression, a silent witness to the collective suffering they all endured. Taking a deep breath, Rita offered a silent prayer to her ancestors as she entered the dark hallway of the great house. The smell of cured tobacco mixed with sweat, the suffocating humidity becoming a weight on her chest. The voices of other mammies whispered in her ear, shared memories of resistance, of tears and laughter, of love hidden within a cruel reality. Every step she took was a silent pact with all those who had suffered before her. Now, it was her turn to write the story, to be not just a victim, but a voice crying out for change. The darkness of the night enveloped the house, but within her, an untamable flame burned. What was about to happen was not just an act of vengeance, but a declaration that suffering had a price, and Rita was ready to make them pay. She walked toward the unknown, her heart racing, willing to face whatever came next, determined to turn her pain into power. Rita moved down the big house corridor, her heart pounding in her chest like an old drum beaten by sorrow and revolt. The bittersweet smell of tobacco and sweat mingled in the air, sharp and suffocating. Each step forward was an echo of her sisters, of the mothers who had wept, who had lost, who had suffered under the same oppressive roof. The darkness of that night became a familiar, unsettling specter, but within her, a flame blazed, fueled by the desire for change. She was no longer just a wet nurse. She had become the voice of a resisting legion, a shining symbol amidst the chaos. With her hand held steady on the blade, Rita did not falter. The memories of her daughter, so brutally torn away, danced like phantoms in her mind. The pain was a constant fire, but now it fueled her resolve. Hearing the whispers of the other mammies, memories both agonizing and galvanizing, she felt the moment to break the silence had arrived. They were there with her, supporting every step toward transformation, as she finally confronted the system that so oppressed her. Upon reaching the door to the mistress's bedchamber, the woman who had once ignited her fury, Rita hesitated for but a second. But hearing the muffled voice of Eleanor, poisoned by pain and despair, hesitation turned to resolve. The echo of the past flooded her mind, the fear, the pain, the oppression, and she understood the battle was not hers alone. In that room, all the cries of resistance were concentrated. Pushing the door open slowly, a gust of wind moaned like a warning, but Rita did not retreat. The room, lit by a faint oil lamp, revealed Eleanor huddled in a corner, her eyes filled with tears. The mistress, once feared, now looked like a shadow of her former glory. Eleanor's gaze, though filled with shame, reflected something more. Rita saw a vulnerability there, a fragility that had not existed before, and it disarmed her anger. "Rita, you ought not to be here," the mistress said in a weak voice, thick with anxiety. "And why not?" Rita questioned, the reply sharper than she intended. "You think you can spend a lifetime terrorizing folks and face no consequences?" Eleanor's gaze flared for a brief instant. "You don't know what you're talking about. I am the mistress of this house." "You still don't understand, do you?" Rita answered, her voice firm. "The power you think you have don't make you any less vulnerable." The silence hung, heavy and awkward. Rita felt that the mark of the past was not just a blade, but a chain that bound their fates, linking them to what they both were, victims of the same oppressive system. The overseer had brought Eleanor to this place, plunging her into the same web of fear. "What do you want, Rita?" Eleanor asked, the fear showing through her words. "I want justice." There was a ravenous force in her voice, but now the mistress's gaze disarmed her. Rita realized this conversation was not merely about revenge. It was about choice, freedom, and understanding that every human being is capable of resistance, even in oppression. At that moment, the door burst open with a crash, and the overseer strode in, his expression one of complete control. The silence shattered like glass. He quickly assessed the scene, and, aware of Eleanor's vulnerability, smirked. "What are you doing here, gal?" he demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. Rita felt the tension in the air. The room's atmosphere had shifted. Oppression now roared like a gathering storm. The energy was electric. For everyone there, what happened next could change their lives forever. Rita took a deep breath. "We ain't gonna be quiet no more. The time has come for you to listen," she said. The overseer looked directly at Rita, his anger beginning to spill over. He advanced step by step as the hounds barked louder outside. "You have no idea what you're doing," he muttered, his voice laden with threats. Instantly, the blade was visible in Rita's fingers. It gleamed in the lamplight. This was her symbol of protection, for what was to come, and for the lives she carried on her back. The woman who had been silenced was now raising her voice and her weapon. "Doing what's right is more powerful than fear, and you can't stop me." The overseer hesitated, but Rita saw the malice grow in his eyes. He was certain this noise meant nothing. His power came from his station, but Rita knew her strength was rooted in something far deeper, far more true. "That's enough," Eleanor commanded, with a force that resonated and cut through the air. It was not a declaration of subservience, but of resolve. The women's voices were becoming an echo, beating like a collective heart. "That's right, missus. If she's willing to fight, then so am I," a voice shouted from outside. The cry rang out like a bugle call, as if summoning a revolution that had lain hidden in the shadows For too many years, Rita saw other mammies emerge like specters, women with eyes full of determination, who had endured the same suffering, rose from their wounded pride, stepping out of the shadows. It was time for the truth to be exposed, to challenge the system that continued to crush them. The overseer stood in shock. The power he thought he held, the dominance he had always imposed, was about to be dismantled. More and more voices rose up, and the walls of fear began to crack in his kingdom. The big house trembled with the echoes of a new day, and he, the herald of oppression, was about to find that the chains he thought he owned were breaking. With her gathered courage, Rita stepped forward, the blade becoming a symbol of the new era dawning. Each step she took began to turn the narrative, shifting the focus from the oppressor to the oppressed. The space filled with collective energy, and the faces lit with the hope of freedom were joining in an eternal communion. Before the overseer, the symphony of voices became a powerful hymn. The overseer, now in peril, tried to regain control, shouting orders and threats. But his words sounded increasingly hollow, stripped of the weight they once carried. With a swift motion, Rita threw the blade to the floor. The sound it made, hitting the wood, was a milestone, a sign that bravery was now in everyone's eyes. "We ain't afraid no more," she cried, and the force of her words reverberated throughout the house. The fear that had once ruled their lives could no longer live there. The struggle and freedom of the past were joining with the present, and together they were creating a wave of transformation that would defy the chains of oppression. "Bunch of worthless field hands," the overseer shouted, now truly cornered. The sense of power he had dedicated himself to building was crumbling piece by piece as the women cried out for freedom. Eleanor and Rita, now side by side, reflected a strength he could never comprehend. "The truth can't be silenced for long," Eleanor confessed, breaking free from her past station and joining the struggle. The overseer, helpless and alone, realized the revolution was not just a threat. It was a rebirth. The voices rose, resounding like a choir in the storm. Unity had been achieved, and adversity had become an unbreakable force. Rita recognized that every woman there had her own stories, her own battles, her own pains, but there was also life, hope, and trust. It was a mosaic. The big house began to fill with light, the winds of change blowing with a revitalizing force. And so, in the heat and intensity of that decisive moment, the overseer, once so powerful, turned toward the door, acknowledging that his era of oppression had come to an end. However, he could not simply flee. The women had built a wall of resistance with their own bodies, and every one of them was ready to fight. To back down now would be to give up the freedom we were promised, Rita said, her voice steady. With a gesture full of strength, she opened her arms, inviting the other women to join her. What had once been captivity would now become a dance of overcoming. Eleanor, now aware of her role in the fight, moved closer to Rita, and together they turned to the overseer. "We are here to fight for ourselves, for our children, and for the future of our children's children." The words pulsed like a sincere desire to untie the knots that had bound them for so long. The temperature in the air rose, the cry for freedom surging in growing waves. They were resolved, and no force could stop it. The big house shook under the weight of change. Eleanor and Rita, the leaders they had not sought to be, but who now stood as defenders of their reality, raised their hands in a sign of resistance. "I will hear the voices of all who were silenced," Rita said, as an echo of approval rose from the women present. The energy grew like a thread of hope in the midst of despair, and it was impossible not to see it. "The fight won't end here, and we will do this for all of us," Eleanor affirmed, almost a prayer that became a promise. The overseer, though bewildered, already felt the wave of change washing over him. He understood he had lost control, but still, he refused to yield. The clamor of the past was falling away, and the chains that once sounded like a symbol of power now vibrated in the hands of those who had suffered and endured. And then, with a quick move, the overseer lunged forward, trying to show he was still a threat. But Rita and Eleanor were prepared. In a split second, joining together, they directed their energies to the same point. With a powerful cry, the two threw themselves into the fight, their determination becoming their strength. The conflict was not merely physical, it was a spiritual battle, a clash against the forces of oppression that had bound them for so long. Rita felt the presence of her ancestors guiding every movement, every impulse, every breath. The strength in the women echoed among them. They were not alone, they were the front line of the resistance. In the heat of that fight, the big house was transformed. The shadows that once represented pain were now filled with the will for freedom. The overseer, completely cornered, with no power or authority, fell to his knees. It was a moment of transition. The struggle had an intrinsic weight. Even the floorboards they stood on seemed to vibrate, trembling under the immensity of renewed resistance. What began as an assault on pain had transformed into a hymn to freedom and unity, a testament to the chains that were finally being broken. The victory was not a promise of a perfect future, but it was an immense and meaningful step toward change. And so, as the overseer's last cry echoed and faded into a murmur of impotence, a cycle of pain ended and a new one began. The voices of all those who fought together joined in a single shout, and in the shadows of the big house, the light of hope shone intensely. Rita's journey was far from over, but now she did not carry her burden alone. She carried the weight of all the lives that had been devastated, of every mother whose child had been taken, of every woman who had endured and risen up. The chains that had bound her were now trophies of transformation and no longer held her confined. We, the heretic women of the resistance, our voices echo, our strength is made manifest, and walking out of the big house, Rita knew the fight would go on, that the road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face it. With the chains broken, the shadows dispelled, and the pain transformed into strength, it was time to be reborn. The women were marching toward a new dawn, and Rita, with her blade at her side and determination in her heart, was ready to be their protector. And freedom, now taking form, was becoming the most precious gift of all time. The morning light seeped through the cracks of the big house, revealing the desolation that now filled it. The floor, marked with signs of the previous night's struggle, held the memories of an intense battle. As the first rays of sun warmed the room, Rita and the other women, now united, looked toward the future unfolding before them. The victory they had won was not just over the overseer or the mistress. It was a victory over the fear and the invisible chains that had once held them captive. But freedom came with new challenges. Each of them knew that the old oppressors would not let the situation stand without another fight. As the big house became a symbol of the new dawn, Rita felt a surge of energy as she prepared to face what was to come. It was as if the weight of the chains that once imprisoned her had been transformed into strength. Memories of her daughter, the voices of the other mothers, and the tears shed throughout history vibrated like a song of resistance within her. And Rita knew her role was more than to survive. It was to turn pain into action. Gathered in a small room in the big house, the women began to discuss their next steps. Fiery eyes and voices still thick with emotion reflected a mix of anxiety and hope. Each of them, marked by deep wounds, brought with her a story, a desire for change that now pulsed in the air. "We need to organize," said one of the women, her voice trembling but firm. "We can't let this happen again." "I agree, but what about the overseer?" another woman asked, worry etched on her face. Rita looked at each of them, seeing what united them. "We need to be more than victims. This is our time to act. We need to figure out how we can do this together." She remembered everything she had learned throughout her life. She knew that change would not come through brute force, but through the power of unity and collective action. It was time to turn revolt into a cause. "We can make a plan, one that will make our voices echo," Rita said, her speech gaining firmness. "One that shows we are no longer willing to accept this life." A sense of urgency flowed through the room. The women began to exchange ideas, speaking of resistance, of strategies to face the larger group of oppressors still roaming the fields, and the men who still feared rebellion and struggle. Eleanor, who had been silent until then, decided to speak. Her presence and leadership stood out, like a light emerging from the darkness. "I know he won't stand still. The overseer has lost control, but that doesn't mean he isn't dangerous." Her voice was grave. "We need to prepare the children. We need a safe shelter." Rita nodded. The danger was still real, and the overseer's power would not simply vanish. "We have to unite, strengthen our community. We need allies." The dialogue continued, and the desire to form a support network began to grow. They needed a plan of resistance to survive, but also a way to transform the system. And it was this idea that spun in Rita's mind. Freedom was not just personal. It was a collective necessity, a good that should be shared, and for that, they needed the voices of the community around them. "Hattie and Delilah can talk to the other mammies who ain't here, and bring the ones from other plantations," Rita advised, remembering that the fight was not only theirs, but belonged to all who lived under oppression. The women nodded in silence. The idea was simple, yet powerful. Every step of the resistance had to be taken with care and awareness. They realized that freedom could not be a fleeting thing, but a new era that was just beginning. The days passed, and Rita saw the collective effort begin to bear fruit. With Hattie and Delilah leading the way, messages were spread in daily lessons. The words of resistance began to take root in the community. Other mammies, girls, and even some who had been feared, decided to join the cause. A new breath of hope was forming, and determination was visible in every glance. A unique support network began to be woven. One morning, the voices became a murmur among the green rows that surrounded the house. Women and children gathered under the shade of a great oak, a place that held history, a place where someone had once made promises of freedom that never materialized. Now, it was a space of unity. "We are here to protect ourselves and to fight," Rita began, her voice full of emotion. "Freedom must be a shared good. We must all unite so that we never again face the pain we have known. As long as one of us is in danger, we all are. We must act." The women joined together, forming a circle. Each one offered her stories, desires, and frustrations. It was a safe and confidential space where the strength of sisterhood was made manifest. The courage was already there, and the women began to build their path. "We can talk to the men who work in the fields too. Some of them might be willing to help us," said a young woman, her eyes shining with determination. "We can't turn away any chance to gain more allies. Freedom is our goal, and any tasabwa support is welcome," Rita reaffirmed, seeing how the community was beginning to come together. As the bonds of solidarity grew, the mood in the big house was in constant turmoil. The overseer, feeling powerless, decided to make a move. His fury was about to explode, and he sought a way to reinstate the fear that once dominated the place. Whispers reached Rita about a plan being formed to silence the women's voices. Rita, sensing what was coming, decided it was necessary to intensify the organization among the women. After all, the overseer and the men around him were not willing to give up without a fight. In a secret meeting, the lamplight illuminated tense faces as they discussed the possible attack that could come at any moment. "He can't silence all of us if we make our move," Delilah retorted, her determined gaze falling on each of them. "I know the overseer. He's a manipulator, and if he has to, he'll use lies and violence to get what he wants," said Eleanor, and her voice carried the weight of someone who knew that world well. During the conversation, an idea began to take shape. They could not wait for the confrontation to come to them. They needed to move before fear became their only option. It was time to be proactive, to make themselves heard in a way their oppressors could not ignore. And it was this collective force that began to swell among the women. They would unite their skills to ensure their voices were heard in the wider world. With each meeting, the sense of urgency grew in the community. Rita arranged a meeting with the men who worked the plantations, knowing some who had expressed disgust at what they had seen happen. Among them were those who were also willing to confront the old paradigms, but could not see a way out. The conversation would not be easy, but it shouldn't be impossible either. The men had their own lives, their own fears, their own invisible chains and attempts at obedience. They have to understand that they are also victims of this system, and that by helping us, they will be freeing themselves too, Rita said, looking into the eyes of those present. The men were hesitant, but Rita's determination began to touch their hearts. What started as a difficult dialogue became a space for sharing experiences. Some men began to speak of their own struggles and the impositions the social hierarchy forced them to endure. Moving between the stories and the challenges faced, Rita realized the opportunity was there. They needed to create a unified movement. What can we do to stop the cycle of violence from continuing? Rita questioned, her gaze firm and direct. We have to turn this place into somewhere that guarantees us not just survival, but dignity. The meeting turned into a dialogue, and thus mutual understanding began to emerge. The men connected with the women's stories, and slowly the barriers began to fall. If we unite, if the women and the men join together, we can dismantle this system, one of the men pointed out, his eyes now shining with the idea of change. The following weeks saw the union of forces become palpable in the community. The women and men who were once part of the same oppressive system now became a community of resistance. Rita and the other women became natural leaders, not just because of their pain, but because of the strength of their visions and their hopes. The project they had started expanded, and it was harder not to feel the growing intensity of the desire for freedom. However, the shadow of the overseer still loomed. The rumors of his intentions grew more agitated. He had already begun to organize, forming groups to hunt down the women who showed resilience in the fight for freedom. Rita knew they needed to take a step forward before the storm broke completely. In a strategic meeting with the group, Rita made everyone aware of the risk. We need to act quickly. What we've done so far won't be enough to keep going. It's time to make sure that every house knows the truth, that injustices will not go unanswered. The atmosphere in the room had become dense, but the women were ready to take the risk. Bravery was reflected in the eyes of each one. They remembered the pain, but also the light, and they knew a new era of hope was dawning. In the following days, the movement pulsed like a heart, and the voices grew stronger. The women decided to turn every meeting into a celebration of resistance. There were schemes for dancing, writing, and art, all to rethink the space they lived in. Alongside the men, they created a new space of belonging, a collective where their history could be freed from the shackles of the past. In these gatherings, music and laughter began to fill the voids once occupied by fear. But the overseer never stopped watching. He knew something was simmering among the communities and was determined to silence them. One night, as the stars began to shine in the sky, a sudden knock on the door interrupted the joy that filled the place. Rita, recognizing the gravity of the situation, felt her adrenaline surge. It was time to be prepared, to be firm. The voices of resistance now echoed within her, and she was willing to defend everything she had achieved, even if it came at a high cost. The coming clash was becoming inevitable, and, looking into the eyes of each woman and each man fighting by her side, she understood that the sharing of stories was more powerful than any blade. That was the true strength. Between deep breaths and racing hearts, the community prepared for what was to come. They were a network of power, a wave of determination. They were not alone, and together they would face whatever came their way. The fight was far from over, but the step they took together was the foundation of a future that, finally, could be filled with freedom. It was this hope that pulsed, moved, and illuminated the shadows of the night. The air was heavy with the accumulating tension as everyone awaited the unfolding of events. The knock on the door, abrupt and threatening, reminded them that the overseer was not willing to back away easily. Rita took a deep breath, her heart hammering in her chest. But there was no room for fear now. In that house, surrounded by voices united in resistance, there was power. Finally, the door opened, and the overseer entered, his presence as oppressive as a gale. His gaze, made of contempt and disdain, swept the room, trying to find the fear that had once dominated the atmosphere. But instead, he found only determination. The women were no longer willing to be silenced. "What are y'all doing here?" he shot out, his voice like thunder. Rita did not hesitate. Facing the overseer's defiant glare, she stood with her companions, radiant with a newfound confidence. "We are here to claim our space," she said, her voice as firm as steel. "The time for fear is over. You have no more control over us." The overseer laughed, a harsh laugh that failed to hide his nervousness. "You think you can change things just like that, with words? You're slaves. You'll always be slaves," he shouted, his voice filled with scorn. "We are not slaves anymore," Eleanor retorted, her fierce tone echoing in the room. "We are women, mothers, and fighters. You can't treat us like this any longer." At that instant, the atmosphere transformed. The voices that were once whispers of fear now became a strong, clear cry. The women united, forming a protective circle around Rita, each of them carrying her own story of resistance. The overseer, facing that strength, began to feel a crack in his own authority. The tension had become palpable. Rita could smell the scent of struggle in the air. Memories of them, initially alone, now formed a front line, allowing courage to smother the pain and oppression. With a firm movement, Rita stepped forward. "We are not here just to fight you, but for all those who came before us, and for all those who will come after us. Our children will not live under your yoke. What we have done so far will not be in vain." The overseer gritted his teeth, his fury visibly growing, but surrounded by the women's strength, he no longer felt so powerful. He tried to control the room, but their fury was spreading like fire in dry straw. "You are fools. You think you can win," he yelled, but his tone was more of desperation than control. "What you want is to divide us," a woman from the crowd retorted. "But that's not going to happen. We are together." A wave of agreement washed over them, and Rita felt their determination was almost tangible. Each of their hearts beating in unison, they had built a solid front of resistance that was not willing to break. The overseer, realizing his trick of fear no longer worked, moved towards the exit, but Eleanor and other women blocked his path. It was time to yield to the force of that resistance, which was now turning into a convective storm. "You will not pass," Eleanor stated, her hand extended in a gesture of power. "You can no longer rule our lives." Rita saw the desperation in the overseer's eyes. He had lost control, and what had been an individual struggle had now become a collective battle. The desire for freedom emanating from the group was palpable enough to ignite a new flame of hope. The fight was beginning. It was a clash not just of bodies, but of ideals. Rita and the other women surrounded him, the strength of their unity materializing before her. With every move, their stories of pain and resilience transformed into strength and revolt. The hands that were once stained by oppression were now joined, creating a wall of protection. The voices rose. The words were not just sounds, but a call to action. The struggle for dignity awakened the spirit of resistance. Rita advanced, her gaze fixed on the oppressor, and shouted, "We will not be silenced." The overseer, confused and surrounded, tried to defend himself, but the ferocity of the women was unstoppable. With a final gesture, he tried to push one of the women, but was immediately surrounded and immobilized. The stories, the hopes, and the desire for freedom that each one carried became a single cry, a cry of resilience that echoed through the air. Rita saw her chance. She approached the overseer, now clearly weakened, and said with a firm voice, "Our time of oppression is over. From our suffering, change will be born. We will never forget what you did, but we will not let you define us." She felt the overwhelming support of the women around her. It was a sacred space, a place where there was no more fear, only strength and unity. The house, that was once a symbol of pain, now became a bastion of resistance. The other women began to murmur, echoing Rita's words. The language of struggle took shape, and more voices joined the war cry. They were not just words, they were promises to themselves and to future generations that freedom was their right. The overseer, in his most vulnerable state, looked into the eyes of the women who so recently had felt alone and helpless. What he once considered control was now dissolving in a sea of united voices. "I am the law in this land," he shouted, but his cry was lost in the force of the struggle forming around him. The answer echoed back, "You are nothing anymore," and the power of that declaration enveloped everyone like a warm embrace. The weight of the oppressor was being broken right there, in the house that had stored so much suffering. Cries of victory began to rise, each woman empowering herself and freeing herself from oppression. In the midst of the tumult, each blow of resistance became a movement of liberation. The overseer, realizing the battle was lost, tried to push forward, but the women moved as a single entity, stronger than any of their oppressors could imagine. Rita perceived the transformation. The house, which had seemed so old and oppressive, was now illuminated with the strength of their voices and actions. It was clear they were not just fighting against one man, but against a system that had kept them in a lifetime of pain. "Now it's our turn to shape the future," Rita declared, her eyes shining. And this was just the beginning. A new reality was forming from that scene, a new one defining what it meant to be free. The women began to move away from the overseer, still fallen and powerless. But the fight was not just a physical victory, it was a moral and emotional one. They were taking back what was theirs. They were more than survivors, they were leaders. Rita turned to the women around her. "What do we do now? This isn't just a momentary victory. We have to make sure this never happens again." "We need to tell our stories," said Eleanor, her gaze determined. "We have to join with other communities." That idea resonated like a powerful revelation. They were witnesses to the pain, but now they were also carriers of change. With their hearts full of new strength, they began to discuss how they could reach out to those who were still trapped in invisible chains. The house was not just a home, it was now a symbol of struggle and unity. With the firm purpose of keeping the alliance alive, Rita and the women decided to organize a large meeting with the neighboring communities, an open event so that other voices could also be heard. Each of them would bring their stories, their challenges, and their hopes. They realized that together they were unbeatable and that every voice counted. But soon the path ahead proved complex, a constantly shifting terrain. They needed to be sure they would not be targeted for reprisals. They knew the overseer, though defeated, might try to regain his power with more violence. It was a shadow that still haunted them. Rita, standing before the women, felt the responsibility grow on her shoulders. It was not just about them. It would be a movement that could change ever generations. They were now the guardians of a renewing spirit, of a future where their daughters would not feel fear. The following weeks were of intense planning and bonding. They met frequently, discussing strategies on how to continue the fight and fueled the movement that had been born. Friends in the struggle joined them, and one by one, many voices joined the cause that was greater than any one of them. On a set day, the women were ready to hold an assembly. The field was full. People from all over the region began to gather, holding hands, hearts pounding. Rita looked at the crowd and felt a wave of emotion. The power and unity of that assembly was exactly what they had hoped for so long. "This is just the beginning," Rita shouted, and the crowd began to respond, their voices filled with hope and determination. "We will build a new future together." Together, they began to narrate their stories. The women spoke without fear, their voices echoing across the field. They shared tales of struggle and resistance, and what were once just echoes of pain now became the foundations of a new collective identity. Hearing the stories intertwine, Rita perceived the strength of that moment. It was unbeatable. The idea of freedom was not just a word. It had become a pulsating reality. They were creating their new history, one that celebrated their struggles and achievements. The voices of men, women, and children joined in a vibrant symphony, a cry for equality that would spread throughout the community. The overseer, a distant memory, became just a shadow in a space now overflowing with hope. As night fell, the starry sky was a testament to what they had achieved. Rita and the other women watched the vastness above them, their hearts full of gratitude for the journeys they had chosen to take. They had found each other and were determined never to be separated again. Resistance was now a mantra, a promise that echoed in their hearts. It was not just a fight for a better life, it was a fight for freedom, a future where there would be no more chains to bind anyone. And so the fight for freedom became more than a battle. It became a legacy. They were the flame that ignited hope in the lives of those around them and challenged the world to change. The night that began with uncertainty now overflowed with light, strength, and promises. The field, lit by small bonfires, symbolized the rebirth of a spirit that had definitively been set free. The stories were no longer just memories of pain. They were now songs of resistance that would echo for generations. The future was theirs, and looking at each other, Rita saw that they had all been transformed. They were united by meaningful experiences and would always find each other again in the strength of the voices that sang for freedom. So, at night, under the starry sky, their story would continue to unfold, filled with courage, resilience, and above all, love. With the dawn bringing a new day, life in the community began to reshape itself. The voices that had once been silenced now rang out loud and clear, resonating everywhere like an echo of hope. Rita walked through the laneways feeling the vibration of change around her. Every face she saw reflected a new determination, a new identity forged in hardship. Now, the community meetings became a ritual, a sacred space where concepts like belonging and mutual support were celebrated. The women, along with the men, gathered to discuss the future, recalling the stories of struggle they had shared, but also planning for what was to come. It was a collective commitment to never again let fear rule their lives. One afternoon, during one of these gatherings, Rita sat amidst the circle of friends and family. The atmosphere was electric, full of expectations and blooming ideas. Eleanor sat beside her, taking Rita's hand. "What do we do now?" she asked, anxiety showing in her words. "We need to reinforce our message," Rita replied. "What we lived through cannot be forgotten. Everyone who suffered must hear and feel the strength of our voices." The group around them agreed, and a plan took shape. They would create a story festival, a day dedicated to sharing their experiences, opening a space for everyone to speak and be heard. The event would be a celebration of resistance, but also an opportunity to educate about the inequalities the community faced. In the days that followed, the festival's presence grew like a flame. The women took center stage, with their dances and tales. History lessons and dialogue spaces were organized. The children were included in the preparations, learning from an early age the importance of their voice. Rita felt her own energy renewing with every laugh and every story that was shared. When the day of the festival finally arrived, joy was written on the faces of everyone present. The field was prepared, colorful banners were hung, and bonfires lit up the darkness at dusk. The air smelled of home-cooked food, and the music sounded like a hymn of freedom that filled the space. Rita watched it all with pride. It was a testament to what they had achieved. It was a day to embrace their narratives, where each story added to the glorious tapestry of their lives. The voices that were once silenced now rose like a unified choir. "Welcome, everyone," Rita began, excited, speaking to the crowd that had gathered. She looked into the eyes of those people, their perspectives and hopes reflecting back at her. What we lived through was not in vain. Every pain was turned into impulse, and resistance into freedom. As her voice rose, the crowd responded with applause and shouts of support. That energy seemed like a wave, navigating the air, flowing from heart to heart. It was a magical moment, where past and present collided in a single declaration of strength. The festival continued, and the women began to share their stories. Each account was a journey of pain, struggle, and resilience, but also of hope. Each person spoke in their own way, and as she listened, Rita felt the collective strength intensifying. What was individual pain began to become a cry of freedom. An old friend of Rita's, Aunt Clara, took the stage. Her grey hair was a symbol of the many battles she had already faced. "When I was young, I always believed that freedom was a distant dream," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "But today, I see that we have united. We have become stronger, and I will always hope that the future generations will be even stronger." The crowd erupted in applause. Even in the midst of pain, Aunt Clara had found a way to illuminate the past with renewed hope. Rita smiled. The vision they had for that night was taking shape, and freedom was beginning to feel like a reality. The festival went on, each new story echoing feelings of struggle and love. Rita took the floor again, unable to contain her emotion. "We fight not just for our generation, but for all those to come. May they never feel afraid to be who they are. May they always have space for their voices." Rita's words echoed in everyone's heart. And so, from the sheer vulnerability that existed before, an indomitable strength had been born. The event became a living record of who they were and what they were willing to fight for. That night, fireworks began to light up the sky, reflecting the inner light of every person present. The community was united, and everyone shared a new hope. As she looked around, Rita realized that there, among them all, was a deep sense of belonging. With the festival drawing to a close, the sky was lit in vibrant colors. The people's faces were illuminated by more than just light. It was the light of collective hope, of recognition. If they had felt alone before, now they stood side by side, and with that, each one would leave their mark. After the festivities, Rita and the women reflected on all they had achieved. The atmosphere carried a renewed sense of purpose, and they knew the fight would not stop there. The festival was not just an event, it was a catalyst for future actions and a commitment to continue the voice of resistance. The group decided to meet weekly to discuss and plan. The idea of creating a community association gained strength, a space where voices could be heard, where knowledge could be shared, and where education became a weapon against oppression. Every woman present became an ally in the fight for equal rights, standing firm in the principles of solidarity. Time passed, and so the association began to flourish. The women started training programs, self-help courses, and support groups. The men also got involved and began to join in, supporting this new movement as it solidified. With every step taken, the feeling of belonging grew stronger, but not without challenges. The overseer, though distant, still haunted the community. there were lingering echoes of the times when control was absolute and threats of reprisal began to surface again. This, of course, caused concern among everyone, and it was a reality they could not ignore. In one of the meetings, the subject was brought up. Tension hung in the air, and Rita realized that despite their achievements, the fight was far from over. It was necessary to be prepared for any eventuality. Eleanor expressed what many were feeling. We can't let fear return. If we are united, we will be stronger than any threat they can make against us. Exactly, Rita agreed. If they want to silence our voices, we must shout even louder, and so the training began. They organized into groups and began to empower themselves, training not only in self-defense, but also in leadership and public speaking. The sense of protection became vital. Each woman became a pillar of strength, and the atmosphere that was once one of vulnerability now became one of shared power. One night, as they prepared for another meeting, news arrived. The overseer was planning a return. His threats of retaliation were already beginning to be heard. The women were aware of the possibility of clashes and confrontations. The mood grew tense, but at the same time, their determination had grown exponentially. If they come, we will be ready. Eleanor's voice rang out like a call to resolve. We will not give up what we have won. Eleanor's words became a mantra. They joined together in unity, a solid pact between friends, sisters, and accomplices. The new beginning was here. Their story was unfolding in every action. What had once been fear and pain had transformed into power. Rita, looking at the middle of the crowded room, saw more than just women. She saw warriors. She knew the fight for freedom would never be easy, but the flame of resistance grew tirelessly, and she was certain that together they could overcome any obstacle. That night, before sleeping, Rita looked one last time at the stars. They shone brighter than before, symbolizing that the dreams dreamed there were becoming the new realities. Patches of pain and experience were the paths that would lead them to a future where the voices of resistance would echo through time, leaving deep marks on the land. And so, as the days unfolded, the journey for freedom, equality, and social progress continued, and Rita and her friends were well aware that they were more than just survivors. They were creators of a new legacy. Resistance